and welcome to all the participants in this session. I'm Divyanshu Pandey and I'm a finance analyst at JSA. We all know that the ordinance has suspended a certain...
Your voice is breaking, Divyanshu.
Sorry, is it better now?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah. This presents a great opportunity for all the stakeholders involved in the insolvency ecosystem to use this period to think of means and tools that can be deployed for improving our insolvency framework. It also presents an opportunity to prepare ourselves to deal with future wave of insolvencies which may arise on account of COVID-19 pandemic. In this backdrop, I have a very distinguished panel to discuss today's topic. I have with me Devanshu Mukherjee, who is a co-founder of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, a New Delhi-based think tank. I have Somsekhar Sundaresan. Som is a counsel practicing in litigation in the field of economics and administrative law. We also have Sundaresh Bhatt, who is the founder partner of business restructuring practice at BDO, and as an insolvency professional has been involved in many insolvency resolutions. Lastly, we have Vishal Gupta, who is a senior vice president at SBI Capital Markets and has been involved in very large and complex. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us today. Thank you very much for joining this panel. So I would like to start the discussion by asking you, Devanshu. Pre-PACS as an insolvency resolution tool is being advocated as a reform for resolving insolvencies and to reduce the burden on the courts. In that context, do you think the insolvency law should adopt a prescriptive approach for a pre-PAC framework, or should it be left to the commercial wisdom of creditors and debtor? And should pre-PACs are designed to protect interest of all stakeholders, or are they skewed in favor of the financial creditors? Over to you, Devanshu.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chandiok and everyone for India for organizing this.
Can you speak a little louder, Divyanshu?
Sorry, I was saying thank you so much, Divyanshu and everyone at Insol India for that's our concern. In our assessment, it can be a very effective tool, even if you take the crisis out. Given the kind of tendency we were seeing even before the crisis kicked in, a pre-PAC scheme is designed appropriately can be very effective for solving a lot of factors. But the only challenge in the Indian context is that for it to be successful, the plan that one agrees to in a pre-PAC scheme, it actually has the same legal status as a resolution plan under the.
Devanshu, you're fading. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
I was saying for a pre-PAC scheme to be effective, a pre-packaged plan should have the same legal status as a resolution under the IBC. There is no need for an intermediary or another layer between an out-of-court restructuring and a full-blown IBC process. So therefore, it has to be a very well laid out prescriptive regime. There is no need for a halfway house between an out-of-court restructuring and a full plan. And one more second question was, to what extent should other stakeholders be involved? I think pre-PAC by definition has to be a confidential process for it to be successful. But again, the key challenge is because under the regular IBC process, the operational creditors are not really involved, and they're in a way compensated by lots of protections that are granted to them, and also through this robust claims collection process that happens under the IBC process. I'm not sure how we can replicate that in a pre-PAC, because the moment you do a public claims collection process, you lose confidentiality, and then it pretty much defeats the entire process. So possibly, pre-PAC sales could be easier to achieve, where you sell the business as a going concern, put the money in an escrow account, and then after that run a claims collection and distribute proceeds in accordance with the the waterfall under the code. But I'm not sure as to how would we do a confidential run a confidential pre-pack, and at the same time respect the rights and respect the rights of operational creditors. That's going to be a big challenge in the Indian context.
Thank you, Devanshu. And in fact, you've raised a very interesting point about this fact that the pre-packs have to have a confidentiality related aspect, and which could impact the process, especially if the other stakeholders are not involved and it's only being negotiated between the debtor and certain creditors. Because we have seen that the current IBC process has also been mired with process related litigation. And this brings me to my second question, and that is to you, Som, that given the fact that pre-packs have an element of confidentiality and negotiated arrangement, will this make pre-pack more susceptible to process-related litigation, thereby delaying the time-bound resolution? And if yes, then what safeguards should be adopted to prevent such litigation? Sorry, so you're on mute. Yeah.
I think the answer lies in marrying the objective of having a speedy pre-pack with not getting bogged down by prescriptive legislative framework. So we need to think through about, would it be possible to have a principle-based legislative stipulative framework which enables that confidentiality, and under which parties can run the pre-pack and make it work. One will have to think this through, because most of what's driven the evolution of jurisprudence in under the IBC in our country has also been heavily rooted in the principle that these borrowers, which are large corporate citizens, so to say, whether they are private limited or public limited on paper, they have a large impact on society, and therefore confidentiality in the process, where do we draw the line between confidentiality and something surreptitious being guarded against, is a question to ask. So some sort of a legislative framework to make it work, with perhaps a post facto availability of transparency, is the way to go. I don't claim to have an answer, but this is something to think about. Devanshu is absolutely right. The confidentiality element is what brings in the speed with it. And if that is compromised, we effectively can't have a framework that would effectively work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Devanshu, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Som. That certainly indicates the fact that one will have to do, and all the stakeholders will have to come together to do a fair bit of thinking in terms of the pre-pack framework and whether it should be prescriptive and how best the core principle which it wants to achieve it should be designed that it achieves. Moving on, because
just 1 minute, Devanshu, if I can add something.
Yes,
what I wanted to say on the pre-pack process is that we have been discussing it off and on. That having a pre-pack definitely helps, but we need to have a system, because ultimately what happens is that for the committee of creditors to take a decision on any particular package, they need to run a transparent process, so that basically that price, whatever they're getting for the asset, that is basically there's some benchmark for that, and that benchmark and that can be tested in the market. So ultimately, you have, even if you have a pre-pack, you still have to do a SIS challenge or some other competitive process, so that you can establish that this is the best offer that you're getting. Then of course distribution is a totally different matter altogether. How to distribute that to the secured lenders, the unsecured lenders, other creditors. So basically, what I feel is that confidentiality happens only in the initial part of when the package is sort of being discussed. But once the package is sort of finalized, or you arrive at certain certainty, then you anyway have to basically go ahead and do a transparent bidding process to sort of, make sure that that's the best you get in the market. So that's one point which I wanted to add here.
Divanshu, if I may add something with your permission.
Yes, please, Sundaresh.
Yeah, see, actually, this prepackage, as you know, it's being discussed from quite some time, and then I think lenders also would like to have it, and as well as the rest of the stakeholders. But if you see, this point has been discussed even outside India. I mean, if you see, Netherlands is one country where I think they are close to get this kind of a legislation up and running, which is in between the UK kind of a legislation and the rest of European, and Netherlands is trying to bridge the gap, where the interference of the court is to the minimum, and outside the court there are many of these transactions or decisions are taken by the stakeholders, and they arrive at some kind of a plan, and then they get into the court as a formal process and get it approved. But in India, if you see, there are various other points to be thought about as well. Now, what happens in India, in these places, it is all debtor-driven kind of a mechanism, whereas in India, it's a creditor-driven kind of a mechanism. Now, if you go into a purely pre-packaged kind of a proposition, then what will it be? Will it be a creditor-driven or it will be a debtor-driven? Will there be a change in management or there may not be a change in management? What happens to the whitewash kind of provisions? How will you give a company who is going to take over, will have a clean slate kind of a company with him? What happens to 29A? Do you want to give a second chance or third chance or fourth chance to the existing management and the existing defaulter, the same company back, and take it back to the insolvency IBC process? So all these things need to be thought of in totality before we get into a kind of a settlement before IBC and then take it to IBC. I mean, I'm sure all the people who are here and all the people who are listening, I mean, after a long thought out process, I think we have come to a conclusion that IBC would be a last stop kind of a solution, or if at all there is a solution, it could be got in IBC process. Because there you have some kind of a protection for lenders who can take a haircut. There is some kind of a court-related backup. An adjudicating authority is going to adjudicate upon it and give a backup to all the people who are taking decision. And there is a full-fledged transparency and competition, a fair competition, which is publicly known to everybody. So I think a lot needs to be, as Divanshu said and Vishal also said, I think we need to have a comprehensive kind of a policy on this, which needs to come up before this entire thing can go into an official kind of legislation.
So what I hear is the fact that like the dichotomy would be to manage running the transparency, the process in a transparent manner, and also essentially maintaining the confidentiality of the whole arrangement, because until such time we find a scheme to marry the two or protect the interests of the various stakeholders to some extent, because if these two objectives are at odds, then having a framework for pre-pack which is successful appears to be challenging in the context, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, with that and moving on, because of the fact that like we have witnessed 3 years of implementation of IBC, many changes as people have. Sorry, am I audible, so?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah. As IBC has evolved, people have kind of successfully contributed to its evolution and implementation as well. But there can be ways and means by which the process can be improved further. And in that context, coming over to you, Vishal, do you think that is at the table could at the committee table?
Can you repeat the question? Actually, your voice is breaking.
Your voice is breaking.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why the network is playing up at my end. So I was saying, Vishal, that should OCs be considered to be granted a seat on the COC table? And will it minimize litigation and facilitate time-bound resolution? And if that happens, do you think the financial creditors would be open to that idea?
So when you say OC is operational creditors, right?
Operational creditors, that's correct.
Yeah, so basically, I think so. Whenever we design a scheme, if we are fair, because see, operational creditors are a very important part of the entire, the chain or the entire activity of the business. So basically, they were there. In typically a large company, you have suppliers who are dedicated to you and maybe making stuff only for you, or also you have other things. So basically, what we have seen is that operational creditors, if you give them a fair this thing, but it becomes very difficult to handle the number of total operational creditors. They run into a large number in most cases, and accommodating all of their views. Maybe you can take a few key ones, but my sense is that it becomes, even within the secured lenders, sometimes we find difficulty in arriving at a cogent or a easy solution. So my sense is that as long as you're fair and there is some money provided to operational creditors, that should be fine. Maybe we can take a view from some of the key operational creditors, but giving accommodating all the operational creditors, I don't see is a practical way of doing things. It will really be difficult to manage all their views.
You're absolutely right. And in that context, whether, like, as you rightly mentioned, that some of the large operational creditors who could be the representative body for the rest of the OCs, I know they are not operational creditors, I know they are not a homogeneous group, or they may not constitute a homogeneous group, but having a voice in the system, because right now they don't have any voice in the system.
Anyway, there is a lot of informal discussion which keeps on happening. In the cases, in my experience, it's never decided. Although they may not have a seat on the table, the key operational creditors still, get, their views are still considered in some way or the other. But yes, there is if money is not sufficient to pay the secured creditors, then obviously, you can't give a significant amount to the operational creditors. They definitely have to get lower than what the secured creditors are getting. And I know that is the principle is applied.
Okay, thank you, Vishal. Thanks a lot. So in that context, do you think that a resolution will be more effective, especially if there is a framework? And Sundaresh, this question is to you, that if we have a framework which provides that how the implementation of a resolution plan will be implemented, like having a single window clearance, or having a mechanism whereby any litigation which is brought after an acquirer has taken over the business is minimized by virtue of the clean slate principle. Do you think a framework should be considered by the regulator or by the government, which kind of facilitates implementation and post-acquisition transition of a company under IBC? And would that help the resolution professionals to attract better price and bids, because that will minimize the risk which usually gets factored in pricing, the risk of unknown?
Yeah. I fully agree that there has to be a process, after the resolution plan is approved by the NCLT. And prior to that also, the resolution applicant should be absolutely clear on what kind of reliefs and concessions he is going to get. Now, when we started this IBC process about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when major cases were being handled, at that point in time, when the resolution plans used to come, it used to have a list of approvals that was required. It started from RBI approvals, CCI approvals, and then it went on to various other sector-related approvals. Then it went on to various other MRT, monopolistic and restrictive practices-related approvals. So there used to be a list which the RA used to give, stating that I have to take these approvals, and then the advisors to the COC used to give a list that you have to take this approval, or at least try to find out whether you come under CCI or whether you come under this FEMA related regulation, whether you come under this regulation. So there used to be a big list. And then the RA used to actually, it used to be so difficult for him whether I will be able to really get these approvals or not. Now we have gone past that bridge. We have crossed that bridge. So now most of the lenders are also practical, and then of course the RA is also now a bit enlightened on what is to be done and what is not to be done. there are many court cases which have come up which state that, okay, all your crystallized liabilities, okay, we are ready to waive it off, but contingent liabilities, we are not ready to waive it off. Now, there is a lot of case laws which have come up that what will be the role of the RA vis-a-vis the IP. So now, once the entire company is being handed over to him by the court order, what are his responsibilities? Whether IP is still responsible for many aspects that IP could not do during his CRP process or during whatever resolution process, whose responsibility is it to complete? Now, the only thing is that now there are certain issues which is still pending even at the time of passing an order. Like, for example, income tax assessments, which are not yet completed, or not yet, the notices also have not been issued. Excise duty related demands or any other statutory kind of demands. What happens to these kind of contingent liabilities? So now the basic issue is that there has to be a clear-cut kind of a regulation, and more particularly from the NCLT side, from the adjudicating authority side, and also the person who is placing his prayers in the resolution plan application to the NCLT, stating that I need all these kind of waivers or reliefs or concessions. And NCLT also has to, adjudicating authority also has to take cognizance of all these practical difficulties and give a clean kind of a order which says that, okay, this is all waived, this is all concessions have been given. This will give a lot of clarity into how an implementation can be done. Many of the times what happens is that some claims are not recorded during the claim period. Once the RA takes over a particular company, these kind of claims pop up. He says, oh, this was not known to me, this was not known to me, this is the relief I wanted to ask. NCLT has not given me this kind of a relief. So my personal view is that once an application goes to NCLT for a particular resolution plan, it has to have a proper reliefs and concessions, and it should also have an automatic kind of a provision there that such and such kind of liabilities or such and such kind of matters which is imperative to be implemented or conducted by an RA, it is given that he has to do it. So there is no specific orders required. So exactly as you said, there has to be a proper policy which has to come out in this particular space, which clearly says that upon resolution and upon handing over of the company to that particular RA, these are all the things which is automatically implied on this kind of a resolution plan. So I am certainly with you for a clear-cut policy in this regard.
So, thanks a lot, Sundaresh. But I think to that extent, and Som and Devanshu, your inputs over here will also be very welcome. Don't you think that a policy which is clearly specifying that what should be the outcome when an acquisition happen, or what should be the way forward which facilitates such an acquisition, would be better off as compared to NCLT granting the reliefs and concessions while approving the resolution plan?
You want to take
So, Devanshu,
the way we see it, I think there are two parts to it. One is the one of the approvals that Sundaresh talked about, and the other piece is actual recovery. So my understanding is that we have problems for both these issues, and although the regulator reports that we have these excellent recoveries, but those recoveries are not actually money in the pocket. They are the recoveries which have been agreed in the resolution plan. And in a large number of cases, actually, those plans have not been implemented. And now, because of this crisis, it's going to be even more difficult to implement those plans. So I think we now need to think carefully about having some kind of a requirement to have much more cash upfront. I think the law is completely silent on it. Obviously, there are some, the practices that in the resolution plan itself, now there are, some, terms as to how much money will come in the form of a guarantee. But I think there is enough and more room to improve that, to make sure that people do honor the commitments they make in the resolution plans. But I don't know in the middle of this crisis how practical that's going to be. I know for a fact that for some of the plans currently, parties are negotiating for much more time than what has been agreed in the plan, and the other side is everybody is granting that time because obviously there is no other alternative. But on the approval side, I don't know if you've taken a look at the recent report of the Insolvency Law Committee. They had a recommendation that as far as the the sectoral approvals are concerned, once a once the COC approves a plan, one can have a 45-day window within which all these regulators can be sent a notice, and then they can respond whether they object to the plan or not. Similar to a provision in the Companies Act, where such approvals are possible through, or no objections are possible under the schemes of arrangement framework. That's not been implemented yet, but the committee has recommended it. I don't know whether it will happen or not. So at least there is some movement in that direction. But I think this is one piece which I think the law was silent on, and consciously, because at that time when we were working on it, everyone thought that we can't be over prescriptive, because then it will only cause more litigation. And the context was BIFR, because BIFR, as some of you might know, had this monitoring agency, etc., which used to monitor and which actually caused more problems than it solved. So, and that's why there was no monitoring mechanism under the IBC. But clearly there is a big hole here, a big vacuum. So let's see how it kind of pans out in the next few months.
So if I may quickly just supplement there, one has to also recognize that no matter what you stipulate, for a legislative intervention in this space to happen, you have to remember that contracts can fail. At the end of the day, the resolution plan is a contract approved by the tribunal. And if there are data integrity issues, like Sundaresh said, or if there are surprises which spring up, which are so material that they go to the root of the matter, you can't rule out a situation where, even in schemes of arrangement, the principle always was that the court will presume the bona fides of the parties, the officers of the court, to present it to the court. But if the integrity of that is undermined and further evidence is found to say that the premise on which a scheme was approved, a plan was approved, itself gets undermined, there has to be an intervention only on the judicial side. Let's remember that we are ultimately a common law country, and we're writing legislation in a common law country. So I think it's important, as Debanshu said, perhaps to have consciously left this open, to get some empirics on the table and see whether there is actually a need to legislate and get into even a principle-based stipulation. Something to the extent of saying a resolution plan, once approved, must ordinarily always be implemented within the time frame stipulated in the resolution plan, absent some principles as to what could undermine it. But the fact is, in a dynamic world, things could change. And there could be situations where a plan, although approved, cannot walk its course as originally contemplated, because the premise on which it got authored itself got undermined. So one has to factor that too in making a stipulation in a legislative intervention, if there is one.
Very valid point, Som, and I think that, like, even IBC as a law has evolved as a dynamic law. It has grown organically, and as a situation has evolved, all these stakeholders, including the regulator and the government, has looked at resolving those difficulties. So I think, still it being at the nascent stage, perhaps we need to give it more time. And as you rightly mentioned, and Devanshu and Sundaresh, that more evidence, empirical evidence, needs to be there to determine the need, whether a prescriptive policy framework for implementation should be put in place or not. Moving on, one of the big controversial sections of IBC has been Section 29A. Given that we have moved, given that, like, we are where we are, and also one of the stated objects in the latest IBC ordinance was that, I know, but that's a different context, but was that there would not be very many resolution applicants. But do you think Section 29A has run its course? And is there a time for it to be relooked at, and can it be argued that there could be a temporary suspension, or we need to revisit it? And this question is to all the panelists, and I would like to start with you, Vishal.
Yeah. Okay. So I know it's a moral hazard to allow, in fact, restructuring also we used to do with the same promoter, and we used to always put a stipulation that a fresh equity has to come in. So that there is some skin in the game. That was the original thinking of when we started the restructuring. And now coming to the only problem today is, if you look at the market, the number of cases is huge. and there are not many buyers for all these companies. In many cases, you have to first stabilize the company and then basically, maybe get some other buyer in. So in case there is interest, then yes, the first choice would always be to search for a unrelated party or a third party, so that he can bring in fresh funds, he can basically turn around the company. But in case that is not possible, if there is no interest, then at least the current promoter should be allowed with some stipulation that okay, within a certain period of time, that company will have to be sort of divested, and there can be various incentives and disincentives built into the scheme itself. And we've done that in a restructuring case very recently, a large one. And basically the whole idea is that yes, today to recover the maximum amount of debt, we first need the company operational and running and stabilized. So if the company goes, if it is not operational and stabilized, things can go down very soon, and you will be left with nothing. So for maintaining that current level of operation, and for maintaining that level, maybe and this is mainly because of this COVID times and because of the current situation in the market where there are not too many investors. Investors are looking for, and that they have too many choices. So not every company which is under stress has a ready buyer. So for the interim, maybe maybe there can be some relaxation of Section 29. That's my personal opinion. But yes, and that is all to aid the recovery in the company. Yeah, that's my view.
Thank you, Nishant. So moving on to you, Devanshu, what are your thoughts on this?
So as you know, Devanshu, 29A was added later. So originally, the committee, thought that since it's the COC which is going to finally decide, there is no point in debarring anyone. But over a period of time, maybe the government thought that there is some value in debarring at least some people, especially if there is criminal conviction, etc. But clearly, even in our assessment, it's 29A is too broad. Even even the current version is too broad. And I think it's high time that the government kind of takes a closer look at it. And even if it's dissolved, if the concern is that promoters have this information advantage, and which if they are also involved, other resolution applicants might be discouraged to submit bids because they know that if this guy has more information, why should I kind of submit? But that can easily be counterbalanced by having a mechanism where you don't allow the promoter to submit bids initially, but allow him to match or submit a higher offer once the auction process is complete. You can actually say, you will allow him to come back only if he submits a higher bid. So that's a very easy way to, kind of solve this. But, I think there is also a bit of political messaging here more than anything else that, if you have kind of driven the company down to the, insolvency and so therefore you shouldn't kind of be allowed to come back. But I think there is no economic logic to 29 in my assessment.
Thanks a lot, Devanshu. Absolutely right. In terms of finding the economic logic to it has been puzzling many since its inception, because the whole idea of keeping a set of people out could have been purely or possibly driven by political reasons, but not from an economic perspective. So what would be your thought on this?
Well, whatever Devanshu said totally resonates with my thinking. I do think 29A is an acknowledged oddity or crudity which is constitutional, but not good law. Not good economics. Good law and good economics need not be the same. If it was felt at that time that political compulsions required the distrust in the system to weed out malpractice by an incumbent promoter, I think time has come to revisit that now. And if you go by the jargons in the pink papers, phrases like dirty dozen, etc. were bandied about then. That objective has been met. Constitutional validity is upheld. But remember, the Supreme Court also said that we, among others, we are taking note of the fact that oddities or crudities that have crept in are promptly corrected in the history of this law. And this is an oddity that needs to be cleaned out. Because frankly, the overreach of 29A effectively has caused one serious impact on the law, which is to stigmatize insolvency. If you stigmatize insolvency, enterprise is going to be affected. It's not just about, there's a lot of 29A which can be retained. Things where there have been fraudulent transactions, where there's been siphoning, all of those can remain intact. But when you take the extreme of a related party, the connections stipulated in 29A, that does need to go. Because if it doesn't, we will be affirming the foundations of a regime where insolvency is stigmatized, and that is not good in the long term for the economy.
Thank you. So all very valid points that the messaging has happened. The fact is that it leads to a stigma. But Sundaresh, how do we resolve this, the problem of 3 C's, the CVC, the CBI, and the CAG, while dealing with public financial institutions, and especially possibly was that one of the reasons because of which 29A was introduced, and it kind of insulates the public financial institutions to justify that the price which they are getting is one of the best discovered prices?
See, my personal opinion on this is that, when a resolution applicant comes and then puts in his bid and says, okay, this is the maximum price I can offer for this particular resolution. Now, what happens is, as you rightly said, there is CVC, CBI, SFIO, all these agencies are there. And then this normal notion of accepting this resolution bid below the liquidation value is a big issue. So now, what we need to really see here, or what we need to really, come to practicality is that, is this company really worth this much? Or is liquidation value a real valuation methodology to accept a commercial deal? Now, what happens is that as per your IBC, you have within a stipulated time, you have to complete your valuation report. And then by the time this resolution is actually sorted out, or a plan is actually received, is somewhere by the end of 330, now it's 330 days, earlier it was 270 days, the plan is received and it's actually approved maybe 3 to 4 days prior to the filing. So you already have 8 to 9 months, which is gone. And then there is a lot of litigation in between, then you get time. So finally, it is never a 270-day affair, it is a 12-month affair, and then 10 months have already gone from the time you actually get a valuation report, because it's on the ICD date. The valuation is on the ICD date. And then by the time you are taking a decision, a lot of things have changed. In many cases, of course, if it is a going concern, yeah, there is some amount of this thing. Where the value of the particular asset is preserved. If it is not a going concern, if it is a dead concern, and then you have a valuation on an ICD date, and by the time you decide it's 10 months hence. So the protection the protection that the lenders need to have is some kind of a decision which, according to, they have to clearly follow the decisions that have been given in SR. Say, for example, where COC has to decide based on its commercial wisdom, and it has to decide based on its practical viability, based on what plan bids they have received. So I think that's the only protection that they can get. I mean, I don't see any particular legislation towards this to come about where they have a protection if it goes otherwise.
Very well understood, Sundaresh. Thanks so much. Financing of during the resolution process, Vishal, has also been a challenge, and financing the acquisition has been a challenge because of the limited sources of financing as per our regulatory policies, be it raising funds from offshore markets, which does not permit raising funds from offshore lenders for acquisition of shares. And even domestically, banks are not permitted to do acquisition financing. So given the position which we are in, where we have got huge forex reserves and some very sophisticated institutions have entered our credit markets as well, do you think the government should relook at these restrictions to facilitate financing where it can easily be tapped into? And if there should be any restrictions, what restrictions could be on such a policy which facilitates acquisition financing?
I won't totally agree with what you said, Divyanshu, because we have seen transactions in the past where by proper structuring we have actually done some financing for the acquirer, where we have some additional comfort from the acquirer on the debt. With proper structuring and credit enhancement, financing can be done for these takeovers, especially where the new person who's coming in has a good credit rating with the bank and a good track record of the bank. That is possible. But at the same time, I do agree with you that for the larger assets, sometimes it's a challenge to get that funding, and definitely you need to have other sources of funding, and basically maybe a larger pool of funding available. There are a lot of funds who are there in the market. They have a lot of dry powder, as they call it, and for the right asset, there is funding available even today. I don't see that financing as a major challenge so far. I think so. What the major challenge I see is in terms of the valuation. I think so. Where I think what the buyer is willing to pay and what the seller is asking for. When I say seller, basically means the senior lenders and the junior lenders. Another challenge which we have is the leakage which happens in most of the cases in listed companies, because of the current SEBI regulation to equity shareholders. Whereas, when you're talking about a stressed company, typically, and you're talking about the enterprise value, so the enterprise value, and if you look at the debt, it's basically debt. So basically, the debt itself is not covered in most cases. So the equity value is typically zero. But because of the way the current SEBI regulations are, and because of that, the issues, there is a lot of leakage which happens, especially if you want to buy a stake of the company and take over the entire company. If you're buying just the assets, then it's a different proposition. You can still structure a deal wherein there is, through a slump sale, you can structure a deal wherein you are just selling the assets of the company and the balance company remains. But in most cases, I know lenders and other people are interested in selling the whole company as a going concern. And therein, I think so, we have a greater challenge as to how to structure the deal so that there is no leakage. The recent SEBI amendment has simplified it a little in terms of, the 2-week pricing and no open offer. I think so that has sort of simplified the entire thing. But I still feel that there is scope for improvement there, because we have seen in a recent case, again, which we are sort of currently involved in, and where basically there was one bidder who was interested, and the day he actually put the bid, even though it was not publicly known, the share prices started going up, and and now it would have made the entire deal not doable, because once the equity goes beyond a certain valuation, and there is no value left in the company. If you really look at it, it's a company where there is no cash flow today, and I simply fail to understand how anybody can sort of do the value. It's just that the entire trading volume is very thin, and there is a lot of speculation, so price goes up. So we need to find a different a different parameter for basically that pricing. Instead of even that 2-week high-low, basically we should go to either book value or face value, whichever is lower. So some such pricing. So basically, that is one very key issue which is required for resolution, I think so. Maybe I digressed a bit, but it was connected, so I thought I'll cover it here.
No, very relevant, Vishal. Thank you so much, because that has also been a hindrance in evolution of an effective insolvency resolution framework, both in court and out court, where we have seen that there has been lack of coordination amongst various financial regulators in their policies. So while exceptions were granted for IBC, but then there are certain exceptions which are granted for IBC are not available if you are doing an out-of-court restructuring, such as under the Prudential
Correct.
BI, right? And that's where it brings me to my next question, and this is for all the panelists, and to start with you, Devansh. Do you think that a possibility where this coordination can be achievable in the Indian context And if yes, how? And will such coordination help in developing a more robust insolvency resolution framework, both in court and out of court, and including hybrid framework, something like a scheme under Section 230?
Right. So I think the biggest challenge is that, as far as exchange control is concerned, it's handled, very differently from what we are trying to achieve under the IBC. And so therefore, it's, I think, virtually impossible for us to kind of say how because, RBI's logic for ECB regulations, end-use restrictions, etc., are like completely, unconnected to bankruptcy. They have largely to do with exchange control. So therefore, I'm not entirely sure as to how do we kind of find a solution, even if they were to come together, unless you kind of, RBI kind of takes this call that, since this is going through NCLT, there is no risk of round tripping, etc., and because it's being blessed by a court, and therefore we'll not bother about all of this. And similarly for regulations around acquisition of shares, etc., again, RBI's concern is driven by entirely different reasons, unconnected with bankruptcy. And here, clearly, if we have a more flexible regime, it will help investors raise more money for carrying out the acquisitions. But in the Indian context, I think there is no one single authority with which has the jurisdiction to take a call on these issues. And I think probably Ministry of Finance would come the closest, but even they wouldn't have all the powers, because IBC is under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So yeah, so unless again they form some kind of a committee where everybody comes together and arrives at some solution, I don't really see. Look, they're doing a lot currently under FSDC because they're responding to the crisis, and a lot of calls that are being taken, are also affecting the IBC ecosystem. So other than that, I'm not entirely sure how, from a policy perspective, this can be resolved efficiently. Although some exemptions have been given, and the reason for giving those exemptions, Divyanshu, is that because it's being blessed by a court, so the regulators feel that okay, we will not bother. But I'm not sure they'll be comfortable with those exemptions outside the IBC ecosystem. So, and that's how my sense is that's how some of these exemptions are not really come through, both for takeover offers and others.
Thanks, Devanshu. So do you think then, like, that FSDC, or for that matter, should we have a regulator of all regulators who sit?
So frankly, I would be a little wary of elevating a resolution to a level where other regulatory concerns of the respective regulators need to be undermined. It's important to bail companies out. It's important to resolve it. It's important to try and sell assets or do statutory M&A activity as envisaged in the IBC. Having said that, if say an M&A under a resolution plan has a serious debilitating impact on competition law considerations, the answer should be no, and that reality cannot be wished away. So I think by design, we need to have multiple institutions, each looking at its own objectives. How effective they are and how timely they are is something else. That's something to, I think what we need is institutional reform to strengthen the institutions, rather than say that those institutions should be undermined with some super regulator when it comes to a bankruptcy. Where do you draw the line then? For bankruptcy transaction which involves multiple regulators, you suspend your logic. Someone else may say for some other activity, it's very important in national interest, and therefore we undermine, and we again will go up with multiple errors in the path. So I don't think there should be a super regulator. I think one has to be more alive to the objectives that each regulator seeks to achieve. For example, the securities regulator, its primary objective is the investor protection. Now it needs to ask itself, if a company goes bust, are the investors better off, or are the investors better served by the company being resolved? And if their answer is the latter, they definitely need to take a close look at their regulations and say, what can we do to make it work from our regulatory objective, which is investor protection? Now they need to see value in the proposition for their own. That is not happening today across regulators. Each regulator is looking at its own objective dehorse what is the wider objective for its own constituency. So therefore, I think with time, look, it's an adolescent law. At the end of the day, 3 years is infancy, not even adolescence. And we need to give it some time, and some more pressures will emerge from society, which will make regulators look at. SEBI is already looking at a pre-NPA scenario. How can they help companies raise money in a more flexible manner rather than through the preferential allotment norms of market price? And we've had historical examples ranging from Global Trust Bank to Jet Airways, where companies have actually gone to seed and investors have lost out. The minute the securities regulator sees enough of that and says, okay, this is something we really need to do with our objective, it would address that. The CCI was, in fact, claiming on tweets as to how rapidly it has approved some of the resolution applicants' proposals for companies under IBC. So each regulator will start seeing value within the framework of its regulatory objectives. It will take some more time. I think we should let it evolve and nudge it rather than regulate them.
So, understood, so, and I'm very conscious of the time allocated for this webinar and of everyone else's time. We are almost exhausting that time. So just the last question for this esteemed panel, and moving slightly away from today's topic in terms of the reforms which are required. 1 point each as a pro and con from each one of you on the latest IBC ordinance. Starting with you, Sundaresh.
I mean, my personal view, I think it's in the right move, basically. So earlier there was a lot of confusion. I think the ordinance has cleared that confusion between 25th March, pre and post. So I think it's in the right direction as far as this COVID is concerned. That's my personal view, that all those companies which were prior to 25th of March, which were anyway NPAs, they should be allowed to go into IBC if required. I mean, it is lenders' choice to take them to IBC. COVID respite for these kind of companies is certainly welcome. That's my personal view. And the negative part of this, I think, is also again my personal view, is that there is debt due to COVID, which I think will be a welcome proposition to all the lawyers. No offense, I mean, so respect all the lawyers here and advocates here. But I think that will be a point of litigation, I think, for some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sundaresh. Over to you, Devanshu.
In our assessment, I think it's, theory, it sends the right message. People are suffering, so there is this exemption. But I'm not sure in practice how much does it really help, because currently you already have an RBI moratorium in place, and I think it's there till August end. And then I think one will really know the true value of this once that moratorium is lifted, if at all, and then because currently, in our conversation with some of the lenders, my understanding is that it doesn't really make too much of a practical, change at the moment. But from a policy point of view, our concern is that, one of the biggest, achievements is that this law has had is that, this threat of IBC has kind of encouraged a lot of debtors to, cooperate effectively with creditors to settle their debts and negotiate outside the IBC ecosystem. So now with this blanket exemption forever, hopefully, of course, if there's a continuing default, this does not apply, and then obviously you can take them back. But that thread should not be diluted, and while the government in its wisdom has done this to maybe send the right message, care must be taken not to dilute the IBC, because it's achieved a lot over the last few years. And although this crisis is a huge issue for the industry, I think one has to be really careful because it's a very new law. And exemptions are always a slippery slope. Once you start giving exemptions, it's very difficult to kind of go back to the norm. That's our assessment.
Good point, Devanshu. So, Vishal, do you think that similar sentiment is shared by the creditors as well, that the impact
No,
of IBC
see, actually, see, all the accounts which were even SMA 0 or SMA 1 before that date, the banks can still go ahead and go to IBC, because that legislation is not preventing them for doing that. But I don't think the banks are in any mood to go to IBC anyway, until there is no other solution. So I think so. We always look for a solution outside IBC, and if that company can be put back on track, outside IBC, it's so much better and easier. Because once you go to IBC, although there are a lot of things available, but still IBC itself takes a lot of time. Our experience has not been very good in terms of, except for a few companies, it is a really long and excruciating process for everybody concerned. Many things and things don't remain in the control of the corporate creditors or the COC, because there is a RP also involved, there are other agencies also involved. So basically, you lose a little bit of control over the company also. So I think it's a welcome step. The only thing is, like was mentioned by Divyanshu and maybe Sudaresh, that that basically it should be within a specified time period. So yeah, and that's what has been done actually. So it should not be extended, my sense is, if things return back to normal.
Thank
So
you,
that's
Vishal.
about it, yeah.
Thank you. Last word on it from you, Som.
Since there have been some checking of the boxes on the pros, I'll give you two cons. I think there's a fundamental error in the ordinance in suspending section 10. One thing to suspend section 7, section 9, where a creditor perhaps takes you into insolvency regime, fine. But if the debtor himself wants to restructure at a time, having made ends meet before March, and now unable to make ends meet, and therefore wants the framework of the IBC, to tell that debtor, no, this framework is not available for you, I don't think is a good development. And this will impact the MSME sector a lot also in another way. In fact, there is a fear of the IBC, as Devanshu said, where people paid up. So that's one of the fallouts of people, contracts being honored. Now, tinier companies, the weaker companies, when they engage with powerful debtors, who say, okay, now there is no sanction even of the IBC. You can't be taking me there to take a walk. We will see when it will be, after lockdown. So I do think it's going to have an effect on small businesses on the creditor side. And therefore, I do think there's a need for a relook before this ordinance becomes a bill. There's a need to bring back section 10 approach to the IBC in a calibrated way. Because if the debtor, you're not saving the debtor. If the debtor wants a moratorium and a framework to rearrange his debts. So if the idea is to enable the debtor, section 10 should come back in a measured manner. And likewise, we need to get some empirical data to see defaults and look at how smaller businesses have actually perhaps suffered greater default in the strength of the fact that there is no IBC sanction, there's no sword over us. So let's not pay the small guys, we'll figure. So I think these are two takeaways to ponder over as in the aftermath of this ordinance.
No, very valid points, Som, definitely. And as we see how the impact of the ordinance will roll out and how its provisions are interpreted, especially before it becomes a law, that itself will be a learning for the relevant people and for all the stakeholders to examine its impact and assess it better. We have reached the time limit for our webinar. We will be having a window of 15 minutes, and I can see there are very many questions coming up. So we would take up these questions for next 15 minutes. And first question is, will confidential pre-pack not be in conflict with wrongful trading? Devanshu, would you like to take that, or Sundaresh, Vishal, whoever? Devanshu?
I think we don't have a regime for pre-pack yet. And I'm sure once, if at all a regime is developed, it will take this into account. But the way the wrongful trading provision operates currently, it essentially says that if the company didn't take steps to do enough for its creditors, and the company was becoming insolvent, then the directors can be held personally liable. There is an argument that if the debtors themselves initiated a pre-pack well in time, if a pre-pack regime is there, then in fact it's actually a defense for the directors for a regular wrongful trading action, because they will say that we did enough and more to cut the losses, and therefore we shouldn't be liable under the wrongful trading provision. But I'm not entirely sure about this connection between wrongful trading and confidentiality requirement which this person is referring to, because in my assessment, this is the connection.
Got it. I think the second question was already answered as part of the discussion in terms of the information asymmetry and how the pre-pack can be binding. So there was an indication of the fact that this framework needs to be evolved with careful examination about marrying the confidentiality and, of course, keeping the public accountability. In terms
like
of,
what I mentioned was that basically there will be definitely a price discovery in any pre-pack. So it's just that the pre-pack cannot be implemented just like that. There will be a price discovery, and there will be a process which will be run. Whatever information is shared from the bidder who's buying the company or who's giving the offer will also be shared with all the potential bidders. And depending on the size of the asset, there could be a 1 or 2 stage bidding process. And essentially, sufficient time is normally given. Even in Swiss Challenge, although it specifies minimum 15 days, but I've seen that 4 weeks are typically given in case of large companies. And based on that, basically, some bidding can be done. And so, 180 days or the timeline currently, that should be sufficient. The only thing is that pre-pack would be only for, for the COC and the secured lenders. You still have to sell the package to the other people who are not voting. So, for example, tax department and other stakeholders, you will have to basically, and anyway, in IBC, there are a lot of provisions wherein basically you can get that relaxation.
thank you, Vishal.
Yeah.
Another question, and this question, so if you could take it up, is the fact that is it advisable to, is there any risk in availing the green channel route applicable in case of CCI's automatic approval in a resolution under IBC?
I think the green channel in the CCI is aimed at making it easier to effect combinations. And it's effectively based on the principle of self-declaration and making an assessment on your own that the objectives of competition law have been met. So frankly, there is a lot of debate. Even the CCI has hosted seminars all over the country to get feedback on making this work. There is a fairly serious burden cast on those who avail of it to actually check the box and confirm that the combination works addressing the concerns of the CCI, namely that there is no appreciable adverse effect on competition. In the interplay of the IBC, it's more apt than not apt. Invariably, particularly with the if the resolution applicant, the authors of the resolution plan, do not pose competition concerns, being, say, for example, a consortium of PE investors or a bunch of competitors funded by PE investors who do not have that kind of market share or the ability to have an adverse impact. So I do think, again, as I said earlier, that each of these regulatory objectives within their field subserve a certain specific cause. While the two merge, I do think there is a case for synergy in terms of availing of the green channel for putting through a resolution plan. It is a question mark as to what happens if there is a difference of opinion, that you were actually not eligible for the green channel, then what do we do? Because in an IBC, frankly, there is an in-rem impact on a wider segment of society. So whether COCs would readily, would lightly avail of the green channel, or would they themselves place the bar higher, is something we should let society and its conduct develop. And I don't think it poses a concern at this stage. It's a good enabling arrangement that's available, and we should let it run its course for a while.
Thank you so much. Sorry. Vishal, if you could take up this question where it has been said that should there be a check on the competency of the COC, as sometimes the COC members take much longer time in terms of decision making and refer everything to their internal sanctioning authorities. So what checks and balances could be there to make COC more proactive?
I have been involved in many COC situations, but anyway, it's an internal process of the bank. You cannot short circuit it. So effectively, whatever decisions are taken in the COC, they have to be ratified by the board or the competent authority. So the lenders have to go through the process. What I've seen is the lenders who have larger stakes, they typically come back very fast, because they have much more at stake. It's the lenders who have smaller stakes, say 50, 100 crores, and typically it's not a very big issue for them, and they have much other burning matters. So typically it's more a question of bandwidth, rather than anything else. But there is no way to, the only thing is that what now we're doing is now we have a lesser number of banks and institutions. So, the consolidation has happened. So effectively going forward, I think the company should take, it will take lesser time for them to do. If you have a large consortium of 40 lenders, then obviously, it takes time to reach a decision and to get that thing through.
No, I agree with you, Vishal, and even I believe IUVI has also kind of requested that in the COC, the senior officials should be present, and which banks have started adhering to, which we are also witnessing. So decision
but still, still it has to go through a process. The individual who comes in he can give you a sense of the decision of the thinking of the committee, but ultimately he still has to formally, the note has to go and it has to sort of, come back. Yes. So that process is there.
Agree. So this is a question in your quote, which is the question has been asked in relation to section 10A of the newly enacted IBC ordinance, whereby the proviso provides that no filings can, if a default is occurred during the prescribed period from 25th March till such time that suspension continues. So the question is that what is the legal tenability of such a provision?
Sorry, I'm not very clear about this question.
So some question has been raised that the proviso under section 10A, which provides that no filing can ever be made in relation to defaults occurring after 25th March 2020 till such time the suspension of IBC proceedings are in place, right? The question is whether such a proviso of section 10A is legally tenable or not.
Well, it's legislated, so it's law. The point is a cause of action emerging after that date stands suspended, basically, in terms of approach under section 7, 9, and 10. So regardless of when that cause of action is acted upon, like Vishal said a little while ago, banks don't jump to the IBC. Creditors would look at the IBC as the last resort. So chances are, say October 2021, you approach the IBC, but it's a default that took place on the 31st of March. For example, 10A would come in the way as it currently stands in the ordinance. So, law is law. All law is as Yuval Harari says, imagine realities. If the reality created by the definition of the instrument creates it, it's a reality, it's tenable. Now, is it constitutionally valid? Is it a reasonable classification? Is it arbitrary in terms of treating a default on the 23rd differently from a default on the 26th? These are questions perhaps that will be answered eventually by constitutional courts. Because as I said, some companies would have actually struggled and made ends meet before the 25th of March and may have a problem now because the rest of the world is dealing with moratoriums, not paying up, or is smug on the belief that IBC won't work and therefore default, and therefore this creditor now becomes a corporate debtor who has to default. So these are things that will emerge. But is a legal provision tenable? The way it's drafted, it would be.
Thank you, so. This question, Devanshu, if you could answer, is that given the huge pileup of pending cases, what possible policy changes can be made for the tribunals to cope up with the combined burden of new filings and also the pending filings, especially after COVID?
I'm not entirely sure about policy changes to this problem because, even, without, this crisis, the rate of disposals has been quite slow. And so, and obviously the crisis kind of worsens the problem. But, there is this, thing recognized under the code called information utilities. It's quite underutilized, although now a lot of information has started coming in. And also there is a recent NCLT order that says that now, all defaults must necessarily also be reflected in an IU. So I think there is some scope for the code to be amended, and also there is a recommendation in the recent report of the Insolvency Law Committee. I think I'll now also ask Som about the tenability of doing this. Originally, when we introduced this provision in the law that if there is a record of default in an IU, then conceptually, then that should be the end of the matter because that record has already been verified earlier, and you really don't need a hearing. And then the matter should be admitted automatically, and it should go through because it's only a question of verifying whether a default or not has taken place or not. But then, if we, from the point of view of natural justice, even if it's like very, very clearly established that there is a default, can the right to, being heard be denied? So I think that's a large question, and I don't think law can unilaterally take away that right. And even because, but the original intent, in having IUs and to make sure that the defaults get recorded was just to ensure that the process is smoother. Because I don't know what happens in a hearing. I don't practice. If everything is like verified earlier, what is it that one is arguing in doing admission? So therefore, at least in theory, I don't know why a hearing is required for admission, especially if a record is verified by an IU. So I think there is some scope to make that mandatory, and if that happens, then probably admissions will be smoother. But on the NCLT's own case management itself, a lot can be done. And Som is in a position. He's also trained people in the past. So he knows more about this as to how we can improve case management, etc. But currently, I know for a fact that very few cases are being heard. Is happening virtually, and I think also the fact of the matter is that the NCLTs are poorly resourced. It's not their fault also entirely. So they're also very poorly resourced in terms of the infrastructure support that they get. And a lot of people say that NCLT is working much better in comparison to some of the other tribunals. So since there is so much money involved here, people keep a very close eye and complain. But there are some other tribunals where the situation is much, much worse. So, but I'm not entirely sure what can law do here. It's largely an administrative question that the government has to help the NCLT, and the NCLT has to upgrade its information technology capacity. And Som is much better position than me to answer these questions.
I think I'll just keep this quick. In terms of the utility, the information, integrity of the information, I think that may work well as far as the financial creditors are concerned. When it's an operational creditor, there will be questions of fact that will need to be dealt with to look at whether there is a prior dispute, to look at whether there is a contractual breach, etc. So an ability to have a very automated triggering of the IBC in the operational credit side may be very difficult to implement, because that can really cause serious repercussions. But if the financial system's data integrity is taken to a level where the information coming from the utility is literally completely reliable, I don't see why the law cannot stipulate that demonstrable proven information from there would be adequate to set the process in motion. That's facet number one. On facet number two, I want to say that this includes Devanshu, you and your team, I think we need to rethink the merger of the tribunals that was done a few years ago. What really happened was we just did column A, column B, and merged some tribunals. And into the NCLAT came the COMPAT, for example. Now, I think it's time to demerge and have a tribunal that does only insolvency round the clock. Because let's remember, in parallel, jurisprudence on company law stands literally undermined, because case law is just not emerging. There is no time to do cases on operation mismanagement. There's no time to do refusal to transfer cases, Section 58 cases under the Companies Act. So I think it's time to create an insolvency-specific tribunal and demerge the other parts from the NCLT, NCLAT system into another tribunal if need be. So I think that's something to think about. The current capacity constraints are there for all to see. I mean, these members are doing extraordinary work. They're burdened with work which it's not humanly possible to do justice to, and somehow the system has continued. Now, of course, with electronic hearings, perhaps there would be a paradigm shift in terms of being able to match up the infrastructure of the tribunal to make it effective. So maybe there'll be a confluence of factors that will lead to an improvement. I mean, it's again a very tough decision to make, whether physical hearings versus video hearings, which are more effective. These are questions that are being considered at large across the judiciary today. So I think we'll have to really examine this closely and see what further reform measures can be brought about to speed up insolvency cases. Because frankly, no matter what deadline you fix in legislation, it will end up being directory and not mandatory. So you end up legislatively negotiating against yourself, 180 becoming 210, 210 becoming 330, and so on. So effectively, one will need to think through how to improve capacity. And as Devanshu says, all answers don't lie in legislation. Answers lie in administration and implementation of how to execute these administrative reforms of the tribunal. And I think the next several months must be focused on this, and to see how do we demerge these functions from the NCLT and NCLAT to enable the two different branches of law to run their course and focus a lot of energy on the insolvency process.
Thank you, Devanshu and Som. That was very, very helpful. I'm very conscious that we have overshot the time for our panel discussion and for the Q&A as well. So over to you, Mr. Chandiok, to present a vote of thanks to our esteemed panel.
Thank you, Mr. Pandey, and thank you each one of the panelists from the core of my heart for Insol India for spending the time, giving us time to, I think we have covered right from when we started with IBC and covered with this situation, we have brought an ordinance to do. I think a vast canvas has been covered today. The questions have been appropriate, and I think many of the panelists have come forward with their solutions to the problem. But it looks to me, Som, and to share with you what you're looking at is, I think we need to look at when we bring a law that we have, whether we have infrastructure available to forget the new normal. Even otherwise, whenever we bring a statutory provision, we must look at whether we have infrastructure in place or not. And I think we should also look at, now time has come, whether we have manpower. That means the legislative is one part, bringing legislation is easier. You pass it through a parliament, you proclamate an ordinance and bring it. But who's going to ultimately implement is going to be the real task in the picture. And in this country, we have seen it's actually the implementation that we have lagged behind. Therefore, we need to bring now a cadre. We need to bring in people who are done insolvency, for example, to man our benches, so that this process will evolve automatically. I don't think we need to look at, if we bring proper infrastructure, we bring proper people. I'm not causing any aspersion on the present members of any president or anybody. Each one of them, as Som has rightly said, I think each stakeholder in this IBC should be an example of this country to see, right from the time Mr. Vishwanathan gave the report till the time we have reached today. Each stakeholder has played its role, whether it's RP, whether it's RA, whether it's lawyers, it's all. I know one comment came, it's very good for lawyers to see ordinances. But equally situation today is, I think we have to transform ourselves today. In a hearing today, this morning, I said it's time that these three issues, out of these three, we too could resolve this. And I must share that with you, that during this COVID times, your experiences are much larger. Many times people have approached Insol India and me to say we can resolve these issues out of the insolvency without even whether suspension or no suspension. And we have been able to resolve many of those issues. So therefore, it's time that we must build a further infrastructure into this system, bring a cadring system today. We must look at, we have brought an institute where we are looking at insolvency professionals now. Therefore, we must bring those people into the command to man our benches. And once you have that experience at your command, I'm sure things will move faster. But all said and done, I still feel we have done a commendable job in IBC. I think we should be proud of it. And India got in 2019 an award in the world as best appropriate jurisdiction that we've had. I'm sure we are going to do very well. The new ordinance is, of course, in the times that we are passing through, I don't think there was any choice but to bring that, despite to the industry. Yes, there could be some that proviso has been, as Som has already described, to it's part of legislation now. That's fine. But I don't think it's real intent. If you read the entire section together, I don't think the intent is that even if the default continues after the lockdown is over, you can't go to the IBC. I don't think that would be the answer. The one Chennai bench, I think, has given already a judgment with respect to the same. But all this is evolving. And as we go through it, we have seen how we have evolved in those 12 cases that we brought into the insolvency. How much law has been laid down right up to the Supreme Court. Therefore, these are good positions. And thank you all once again. Wish you all the participants and all of you best in the coming times. We are passing through very hard times, but we are sure we'll tackle it as we tackle many problems. Thank you, each one of you. Thank you, the participants. Thank you, Mr. Pandey. Thank you, everybody.